I can, but
Handled.
yeah, Cantor Shelley's got it, so.
That's fine.
All right, guys, thank you again for joining me for our second installment of Mussar, Intro to Mussar, or what I have been calling Mussar on One Foot. My name is Cassandra Tenonbaum. I'm the Director of Clergy Affairs at Emmanuel Congregation. And I'm going to share my screen with you guys. And I'm going to present. So first, we're going to do a little bit of recap about what we covered last time. So we talked about this last time, that Mussar is a practical, ethical philosophy and practice that derives its philosophy from writings that date back as far back as the 11th century. But what we think of as contemporary Mussar has its roots in the modern Mussar movement, which came to be in the 19th century in Lithuania. Mussar teaches us that every person feels an innate spiritual urge to be righteous and morally upstanding as a consequence of our fundamental nature. And we experience this urge as a need for wholeness, or what we refer to in Judaism as shlemut. As I said, it's both a philosophy and a practice. And so for practical purposes, what that means is, well, philosophically speaking, Mussar conceives of individuals as a whole person or a soul with three parts: a neshama or neshama, which is the piece of us that is made, that is B'Tselem Elohim, that's the image of God, the intrinsic divine within all of us. There's the ruach, which is the source of our emotional energy. And then there's the nefesh, which is our most superficial and influenceable aspect. This is where the midot come in. And then sort of encompassing and floating around and interacting with all of that is our Yetzer Hatov and our Yetzer Hara, or our impulse to do good or bad things. Practically speaking, there are 4 ways that we can improve on our nefesh by strengthening our midot, or bringing our midot into proper alignment. There's text study, meditation, silence and retreat, diary practice, and then kind of tying all of this together are actions that are done on behalf of somebody else. But because Mussar as a practice involves a need for clarity and context, it's important traditionally that you engage in this practice with someone else, and preferably both in partnership or chevruta, and in a small group setting or a va'ad. So back to the midot. Last time we learned that contemporary Mussar focuses on a selection of midot that are found in the whole body of Mussar literature. There's humility, patience, gratitude, compassion, order, equanimity, honor, simplicity, enthusiasm, silence, generosity, truth, moderation, responsibility, trust, faith, and awe. So we talked about some of these last time. We went kind of quickly through them. Last time we were just sort of orienting ourselves within the vocabulary. Now we're going to delve a little bit more in depth for each one of these midot, starting with humility, or anava. Mussar considers this to be the foundational midah. Unless your anava is an appropriate alignment, it's virtually impossible to get any of your other midot in appropriate alignment. So what do I mean when I say the appropriate alignment of anava? We in modern culture tend to associate the term humility with like low self-esteem. And that's really unfortunate because that's not what we're talking about here at all. The truest manifestation of humility is only available to us when we have healthy self-esteem. So it's not about making ourselves lesser than by diminishing ourselves in some way. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about assessing and then occupying our rightful place in any given circumstance, no more, no less. It's important for us to remember that anava is dynamic and situational, like many of the midot that we're gonna study in Mussar. It's contextual, there's space to flex and shrink, and not every person is allocated the same amount of anava in a given situation. So the sages and the Mussar masters held that Moses was the epitome of anava. And I'm wondering, sort of, given what we know about what our tradition teaches us about Moses, and given what we come to this practice as 21st century Americans with this idea of what humility means, what does anybody make of that Moses is the exemplar of anava? Hey, Neil, welcome.
Hi.
Hi. So we were just talking about how Moses is held as the exemplar of anava, or humility.
Right.
And,
I've been here for a couple of minutes.
oh, okay.
I missed the very beginning. Before the detail, I've got a broad general question.
Sure.
I've been doing a little bit of Googling. Is this roughly equivalent to what in our mundane culture we would call character development?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, not exactly, but
right. So it's not a one-to-one comparison, but that is a good rough analogy. Yes.
Okay. I had that feeling, and I wanted to be sure I hadn't turned myself around. Thank you.
You are on the right track. While you have the floor, do you want to share some thoughts about Moses as a humble man, or an ish anav?
I say.
Can you talk about any impressions about Moses as a humble person?
A humble person is not thinking about themselves. They're responding to or dealing with whatever's in front of them, not necessarily with their personal feelings or their relationship. Again, we have the, I don't know, idiom, figure of speech. It's not all about you.
Right.
And someone who lives that way is humble.
Okay.
A concrete example, it took me a while really to put my finger on the quality, but it was very striking that Rabbi Shalman rarely interjected himself into a conversation. The conversation was about what it was about and who he was there. He was not speaking of or paying attention to himself. Mm-hmm. I think that's what you're talking about here.
Yeah, it is. Did you have a thought, Devorah? I saw you raise your hand.
Yeah, because I wanted to get back to Moses being an example of anava, mm-hmm. because he was always, not always, in many cases, he claimed not to be suited for what he was being asked, but he didn't push it too far, and he did what needed to be done without tooting his horn.
Exactly. Exactly. You know, that you're absolutely right, Devorah. And I would also add to that, we see Moses exemplifying anava in Yitro when his father-in-law, Jethro, comes to him and says, hey, look it, I've been doing this tribal leadership thing a little bit longer than you have, and I see what you're doing and what you want. The impulse is good, but kiddo, you're going to burn yourself out if you don't start to delegate. And Moses listens to him. And in fact, delegation is one of the best ways that we can practice anava, by looking at it as an opportunity to take up no more space in the conversation or the room than we absolutely must and are entitled to. And we're giving others an opportunity to grow into what their rightful place will be. So when we view delegation as an opportunity to cultivate other people's virtues, we are engaging in anava grounded leadership. So we're going to move on. So the next midah is patience or savlanut. I had read this quote from Cheshbon HaNefesh last time, but I really love this, and I think it speaks well to our current moment. Ruben, can you read that quote from Cheshbon HaNefesh? Ruben, you're muted.
That's funny. I thought I had unmuted. Okay. Woe to the pampered one who has never been trained to be patient. Either today or in the future, he is destined to sip from the cup of affliction.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So again, and we're going to see this as sort of a common theme in our investigation of the Midot and contemporary Mussar, but we have this concept of patience, I think, or at least I have this concept of patience, that it's about, there's like a martyr-y feel to it. It's like suffering in silence, except, you know, not necessarily so silent in the silent bit, like, but that's not what we're talking about here. This kind of patience is not a way to mitigate or ignore the fact that you are experiencing something difficult. Rather, this patience comes into play as a tool to help us deal with difficult circumstances that are outside of our control. It's a way of tolerating uncertainty. And it's something that is available to us to tap into when any other course of action for remedying our current situation is unavailable to us. So it's important, first and foremost, to take responsibility for our own impatience in a situation. When we are dealing with uncertainty or difficult circumstances or suffering or strife, a lot of the suffering that we experience, that just sort of like emotional angst, is actually a product of our internal struggle with the fact that we feel helpless. And so the first step is to embrace that feeling of discomfort with being out of control. And that allows us to tolerate that discomfort in a way that is sustainable. And it's important for people who could use a little savlanut in their lives, and I know that I'm one of those people. It's important that we give ourselves time and space when we are dealing with challenges to check in with ourselves and realize that even in the most frustrating, irritating, angering of circumstances, we have the free will to choose to tap into our patience, to take a breath, to recenter ourselves, or at least try to, before we act out in that reactive and inflammatory way. And that sentiment, you can feel that in the linguistics of the word savlanut, because it also, that Hebrew root shares meaning with the words for suffering and enduring, but also somebody who carries things. So there's this sense that if you are able to bring your savlanut into alignment, it will carry you through the uncertainty in like a supportive way. The next midah that we will talk about is Hakarat Hatov. And again, this is not about denying the fact that you are experiencing suffering. That's counterproductive. To deny our lived experience is just going to create further cognitive dissonance, which is going to make us spin out more readily. That's the sort of dialectic that our Yetzer Hara loves, is to create that sense of internal conflict, because then we choose the path of least resistance, which is more often than not a product of the fact that we've got a midah that's out of whack in the first place, and we sort of end up doubling down on that. So healthy Hakarat Hatov literally means recognizing the good, and it's not recognizing the good by pretending away the difficult. It's acknowledging that it's possible to hold in our minds at the same time, this isn't fun, I don't like this, this is uncomfortable. And also, there is opportunity in this moment. And that opportunity might be as small feeling as there's the opportunity to learn about just how resilient I am, or I have the opportunity to demonstrate how to lead by example, which, like, in the moment of difficulty, I will totally grant you doesn't feel super helpful. But all it takes is that little, like, fraction of an inch to budge out of our entrenchment in negativity to sort of get the ball rolling. And there have been a number of peer-reviewed studies that suggest that cultivating an attitude of gratitude is beneficial for overall mental well-being. We tend not to appreciate the gifts that we have in our everyday life because we see them every day, so we become desensitized to them. So first, the first step in Hakarat Hatov is tapping back into those unappreciated daily joys so that we can recapture all of the possible opportunities for pleasure and enjoyment in our lives. And when we're really feeling a deficit of Hakarat Hatov, this can start to look like depression, you know, that sense of like, oh, I just don't have the energy to get out of bed, what's the point? If you ever find yourself in that point, in that moment where you are just coming up short on an idea of something to be grateful for, start with inanimate objects. And I know this might sound strange, but I am speaking both from what Mussar teaches us and from my personal experience. This is a practice that I personally find very helpful to fall back on when I'm struggling with finding the positive in a situation. I look around me and I find an inanimate object in my line of sight that makes me feel good, that brings up a good memory, that has some sort of positive association with it. And I allow that feeling of gratitude to fill me. And then that is that little inch that then can help shift me out of the negative thinking. Another thing to remember, sort of broadly speaking, is Mussar is very big on big picture context. And we are reminded frequently that it's not super easy for us to get a good idea of the big picture context when we're really in the thick of it, in the throes, in the moment. So it's important to take the time to sort of step back and see the bigger picture so that we can go about our lives and our work with a feeling of gratitude.
I have something to add.
Sure.
I underwent probably 4 or 5 years where I was severely depressed.
Mm-hmm.
And I acquired, I forget exactly how, I acquired a little yellow doll that you squeeze the hand and it laughs and then it stopped and then it would burst out again. And I can't help, I keep it in my bedroom. My husband said, "Why do you have this?" I said, "It was very important to me at one point, because when you hold it and it's giggling and it's laughing, it makes you laugh."
Mm-hmm.
And I keep it around now. Batteries still work. That just because it does remind me that there was something that could make me laugh when I didn't feel much like smiling or laughing or anything much.
Thank you for sharing that, Devorah. That's a lovely anecdote. And that goes back to what we were talking about of, like, you know, it's important to recognize that even the smallest of things can bring us into a grateful state of mind. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, so next up is compassion, or rachamim, which shares a Hebrew root with the word rechem, or womb, and that's something that I actually learned from Cantor Shelley, who is, I want to give a belated shout out to for tech captaining. Thank you very much, Cantor. So
an honor.
Rachamim, rechem, womb. So what does that tell us? That seems to suggest that that there's a connection here. There's a mother and child connection, right? To tap into Paul Simon. But if we stop there, that's not a very nuanced approach to this emotional connection. So delving a little bit deeper, let's see. Fran, can you read this quote from Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch?
Compassion is the feeling of empathy, which the pain of one being of itself awakens in another. And the higher and more human the beings are, the more keenly attuned they are to re-echo the note of suffering, which, like a heart from heaven, penetrates, like a voice from heaven penetrates the heart.
Nice. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
So, yeah, Neil?
Yeah, well, the rachamim, one of the most famous phrases in Islam, in the Quran, almost every chapter begins in the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate. And it's Er-Rahman, Er-Rahim, which is exactly the same word, but the Arabic version and
right.
derivation.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
And it's, you know, the motherly feeling that is supreme to just about all others.
Right.
And it's interesting to see the people who don't have any.
Well, so Mussar would say, a Mussar teacher would say that it's not that people don't have rachamim. We all have all of the midot. It's that for some reason there is an obstacle preventing their rachamim from flowing freely and appropriately. And there are a number of reasons why that might be. And I will talk about this a little bit later, but spoiler alert, it mostly has to do with fear. So the Talmud teaches us, going back to this notion of creation and mother and child bonding, the Talmud teaches us that rachamim is one of the building blocks of creation. And in a mystical context, there is this notion that rachamim is sort of the balancing fulcrum that has chesed or loving kindness on the one hand, and justice or tzedek on the other. And rachamim is what sort of balances the two. Because if the world was all justice, right, there would be no allowances for any contingencies. Just you jaywalked. It doesn't matter that you were running across the street to save someone who was drowning. You broke the law. You go to jail, right? That's a world with no chesed. That's 100% tzedek. And on the other hand, if the world were 100% chesed, there would be no adverse consequences for anything because, oh, well, you know, it's not kind to be harsh with people. So rachamim is sort of like this fulcrum that balances the two and maintains an equilibrium because it's a blend of the two. You've got the loving, the mother love mixed with the desire to impart that actions have consequences because we're all connected. It kind of comes back to the sense of connectedness. So empathy is often used in common parlance as sort of a synonym for compassion. And I want to just sort of caution us here that this is another instance where the English sort of muddies the water, but Jewish philosophy and Mussar in particular make a distinction between empathy and compassion. So empathy is the beginning point of compassion, but empathy alone isn't enough. Because really, if you're stopping at empathy, then all you're saying is, oh, I just have to have my heart in the right place. That's very nice. It's good to have your heart in the right place. God forbid it should be in the wrong place, like, you know, the left side of your body, right side, whatever, wherever your heart isn't supposed to be. But if you stop at my heart is in the right place and you don't do anything about your rightly placed heart, at a certain point, and that point, it doesn't get you very far. It doesn't matter, like, right? What matters is whether you put your money where your mouth is, or at least that's what our tradition teaches us, that appropriate intention is not enough. It has to be accompanied by appropriate action.
Right.
So let's move on to Seder. The word Seder, and I didn't know this until somewhat recently, doesn't actually refer to the Passover meal per se.
No,
it's the order, right?
Yeah.
So like Anava, Seder is a foundational midah, which is to say that if you don't have Seder in appropriate alignment, it's really hard to get the others in appropriate alignment. And there's a twofold reason for this. One is that Seder is a midah in its own right, but it's also an enabling midah. So it helps the other midot, because once everything is in its appropriate place, you don't have to expend the mental energy to go, where was I putting that? Where is my thing? I don't know what I'm doing. Your mind is less chaotic. So you can focus on what matters as opposed to where are my car keys. But as a midah, as a standalone, the impulse to engage in healthy Seder stems from the fact that part of our covenant with God is that we serve God, or our tradition tells us that. And there are various ways that you can interpret that. You can be literal about it, or you can be a little bit more metaphoric. But the point is that in order to do that, we must bring ourselves closer in alignment with God's true nature. And part of God's nature is creating order from chaos. We see that in the creation story, right? That's fundamentally a story of God separating things and creating boundaries and establishing an order. It's also important, Seder is also important because we're not quite there yet, but in Leviticus, we will see a prohibition against wastefulness. That when the mitzvah is told within the context of like the Israelites are getting close to Israel and they have people who are living there, and they're going to invade the city, and God says, you can't cut down a productive fruit tree. You're not like wantonly destroying things. And if you extrapolate that prohibition out to its appropriate context, the Mussar scholars tell us that encompasses all wanton waste. And they get that, the proof text they use for that is Maimonides. Disorder often stems from a rebellious ego, leading back to how Seder and Anava sort of work together. So if you think about back when you were a kid and you didn't want to clean your room, and your mom said, too bad, you got to clean your room. What's going on there really is that you're a little kid, and your desire to go do whatever you want to do in the moment overtakes the responsibility to have an orderly living space so that you don't have a chaotic environment. And that's what we see a lot in a broader context. People who aren't able to bring their Seder in order, who kind of live chaotically, it's often because they haven't brought their ego into check. So they do not, for whatever reason, take that extra step to realize that their chaos has like ripple effects and it's adversely impacting other people. Yeah, so, the last thing I would note is that by embracing this idea of appropriate Seder, and you know, I've talked about how Seder can veer off into one direction, into chaos. There's another extreme too, and both extremes are equally harmful. And the other end of the spectrum is that if you become so fixated on the order, the where things go, and everything has to be just so, you lose sight of the bigger picture. So I'm not saying you got to take care that the pendulum doesn't swing too far in one direction or the other. But in engaging in appropriate Seder, we're exercising free will, because human nature being what it is, we tend to seek the path of least resistance. And it takes an exercise of contextual thinking and acknowledging connectedness and consequences and anava, to not want your internal chaos to adversely impact anybody else around you, even though it's easier to just sort of like coast on inertia. Which brings us to equanimity, or menuchat hanefesh. I want to start by saying that, again, we're not necessarily talking about a quest for that sort of Zen yoga stereotype of like, I'm just totally calm and tranquil and nothing will ever ruffle me because I'm at one with the universe and I'm at peace. That's not, if you can ever get there, first of all, mazel to you, because that to me seems impossible, but that's sort of a happy byproduct. It's not the ultimate goal because it's not realistic. The point here is to be centered in yourself while at the same time being sensitive to the world around you, so that you can sort of shift and flex as the situation calls for it, without getting yourself all so worked up in a tizzy that you can't like function for the rest of the day. So it's about accepting that life is going to test us, because that's life. And we have a choice, right? We can choose to focus not necessarily on the external stimuli, but rather on our internal response and be curious about that. Or we can get caught up in the external stimuli. Mussar tells us that the better of the two options is to focus on your own internal experience, to rise above both the good and the bad, because they're both fleeting, right? no matter what is going on in your life, it's going to end at some point in time, which to me is like, it's a beautiful thing, right? How fortunate are we that nothing in life is permanent? So the beautiful, pleasant, lovely moments are significant because they're ephemeral, and the challenging, trying, frustrating moments are bearable because they're finite. Like, to me, that's just a beautiful thing.
Well, that's the thing that helps us get through this.
Right, exactly. Thank you, Deborah. So it's sort of, we have to view this not as a Pollyannish impulse to slap on some rose-colored glasses and just like sit and go, everything is fine when your house is burning down. That's not what we're talking about. But rather, it's like I said, it's a centeredness, and it's an acknowledgement that I have control over exactly one thing in any given situation, and that is how I navigate my emotional response to it. So, Menuchat HaNefesh sort of couples with Anava in that way, that it's about focusing on what you have control over, being curious about how your emotions develop or manifest in the presence of external stimuli, and then taking that as your starting point so that you can be governed by your own internal compass and not so much by the actions or intentions of others. Pause here. That is way easier said than done. All of this is way easier said than done. This is way easier said than done, especially when we are in moments of uncertainty or scarcity or ignorance or fear. Like, when we're in extraordinary circumstances, this is much easier said than done, and it is possible. And this is a practice where starting small will produce a payoff. You don't have to tackle all of this at once. But
especially when you look at the Hebrew, which means rest of the soul.
Yes, thank you. So acknowledging that this can feel unattainable or inaccessible, and it certainly is easier said than done, we can achieve this sort of equanimity by bearing witness to our emotional state. So I'm in a situation and I'm at the DMV, I gotta get my license renewed. I got there right as they opened, and I've already been here 45 minutes and there's no end in sight. And I'm feeling agitated, I'm feeling rushed, I'm feeling anxious. So my first job is to stop and say, what's that about? And as you sort of have this conversation or this dialogue with your emotions, because our emotional responses to external stimuli are there to tell us about the situation. They're there to inform us so that we can make good choices. And when we approach our emotional response that way, it's much easier to just sort of like acknowledge, oh, well, I'm feeling harried and anxious because I only allocated 2 hours for this entire endeavor. It's definitely going to take longer than that. I don't want to be late to work. I'm going to seem irresponsible, da 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 da. Right. So you go from that place of, okay, that's what I need to focus on, not so much the, oh, no. So
I found that it's easier to do that to somebody else's overreaction rather than mine.
Sure.
So
I would also suggest that, now I'm not suggesting that you're gonna like police other people's behavior, but I would offer that if you are finding it's easier to sort of Monday morning quarterback someone else's behavior, that is a perfectly appropriate starting place for your own self-inventory. It's not appropriate to go be putting it in somebody else's head, but like, that's interesting. Why is it that I can critique so-and-so's inability to stay calm, but I can't extend that to myself?
And oftentimes when I've done that, especially if my husband is getting very impatient, and I look at him and say, why are you so impatient? We're not in a hurry. We have plenty of time. It doesn't matter. And then he goes, oh, it seems he's gotten more impatient. And sometimes you just have to, and I get impatient when we're trying to get to school on time, which has made my life so much easier because I'm in charge of myself and I can turn on my computer when I'm ready.
Sure.
So
I would, to answer my semi-rhetorical question, I would hypothesize that it's easier for us to critique other people's lack of equanimity than our own because our kavod is out of whack. And now what do I mean about that? Neil, can you read this quote from Pirkei Avot?
Sorry?
Can you read this line from Pirkei Avot at the bottom of the screen?
Oh, sure. Let the honor of your friend be as dear to you as your own.
Thank you very much. So when I say honor, what do you immediately think of? Anybody?
respect.
Okay. What do you mean by that?
Respecting someone, a person, and the root has to do with heaviness.
Yes, it does. And the liver. Interesting.
Yeah, because I've talked to this about my fourth graders because we do Baruch Shem Kavod.
Sure.
Anyway, so Kavod is heavy lifting because you have to, it's hard to give honor, but it's also necessary. And it says that you have to love yourself. If your neighbor as yourself, if you don't love yourself, how can you love your neighbor? How can you honor somebody if you don't honor yourself?
Exactly. So to piggyback on that very excellent summation, we all are inherently merititious of kavod. This is not something that is tied to our social status, our how well read we are, our educational attainment, our wealth. This is at a basic fundamental level. As someone made B'Tselem Elohim, right? This is, we can thank our neshama for this. I have a neshama, you have a neshama, I am worthy of respect, you are worthy of respect. Even corpses are worthy of kavod because of our proximity or our mirroring of the divine. So paradoxically, for whatever reason, most people feel like they do not regularly receive the kavod that they deserve. And that results in this really kind of, if you think about it, heartbreaking conundrum, because the only thing we can do to be even more merititious of honor is to give honor to others. And yet, when we feel like we're not receiving the kavod we deserve, what do? We clench up, right?
Yep. We get pissed.
We get pissed, we get pissy, we get judgmental. How many, raise your hand if you have left the house feeling insecure about the way you looked and then caught yourself in the course of the day thinking something catty about somebody else's clothing. I know I have done that. Yeah. Or if you are all of a sudden feeling like your authority is being called into question and you start to get real uptight about ticky-tacky little things that don't matter in the grand scheme of things. Like, you spelled that word T-H-E-I-E-R and you meant T-H-E-Y''re, therefore you are stupid. Who has done something like that? I know I have. So when
Not lately.
well, that's good. I'm so glad to hear that, Devorah. So when we find ourselves judging and criticizing others, it's because we feel like our own sense of self-worth is under attack. And again, it's sort of an extension of this sort of like heartbreaking conundrum. That's because we're deriving our sense of self-worth from what other people think of us, and not from the fact that we've got this beautiful, unsulliable neshama and are therefore, you know, inherently worthy. So the first step of getting our kavod back in order is to engage in a real honest inventory of our sense of self-worth and our sense of self-esteem, and engaging in activities that can help us cultivate a healthy sense of self-worth and self-groundedness, so that we're not projecting our insecurities onto other people.
Ruben wanted to say something before.
Oh, sorry, Ruben.
My comment was when you take something as simple as the word "cool" and you spell it K-E-W-L.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Very true. Neil, did you have something to add? Neil?
Yeah. Kavod is a word I have a little bit of trouble with. Literally, it's heavy or weight.
Right, weighty.
But in the usual translations, it's translated as glory. You know, the glory of God and so forth. So
Baruch Shem Kavod, the glory of God.
yeah. So it doesn't seem to have a direct, straightforward English translation. I mean, it's partly idiomatic.
Uh-huh.
It appears to me.
Yep. And that's going to be the case throughout the course of study. Yeah. This is something that I didn't really appreciate until I started delving into Hebrew. But it functions fundamentally differently than English does a lot of the time. So a lot of translation is an act of artistic license because there is no good way to succinctly communicate. When we talk to chesed, we'll get there, because it gets a little ridiculous with chesed in terms of like how much ink has to be spilled to truly encapsulate the sense of the word. But you're absolutely right, Neil.
And just try explaining kavod to fourth graders.
Yeah. So it's interesting. All right, I'm going to bounce back to the prior slide for a little bit. It's interesting, Devorah. I've been doing a daily Tanya study, and one of the recurring themes is that we tend to have a kavod bias that within academia, within education, the older and more advanced your students, the more merititious of kavod you are, because the reasoning is that it's harder to kind of razzle dazzle somebody who is in graduate school because they have this body of knowledge that they're coming to the conversation. But that's actually not true. It's much harder to present kavod to a fourth grader than it is to a rabbinic student. So I thought that was a really interesting teaching.
Yeah, thank you.
So moving on to histapkut, or simplicity. Who hasn't read? Devorah, have you read?
I have not.
Why don't you read the Pirkei Avot?
Who is rich? The person who is content with their lot. Most people aren't.
Read the other Talmud too, since we're on a roll.
Okay. The person who grabs too much grabs nothing.
Yeah.
Figure out what you need and don't seek to acquire money. More.
Exactly. So right there. So.
Okay.
Again, as a 21st century American citizen, when I say simplicity as an act of religious devotion, most people's minds immediately jump to some ascetic monk on the side of a mountain in a hair shirt, living on grass and berries and twigs and like contemplating his puppet. That's not what we're talking about here. there's a counterproductive sense that if you are righteous enough, if you are holy enough, you can completely divorce yourself from material cares, wants, needs. And that's just not realistic. I'm not going to say it's not true, because obviously some people are able to do that.
If you have enough money, it's easier.
That is very true. And so we shouldn't mistake the material as the bane of the spiritual, because the whole purpose of this exercise, this whole journey towards shleimut, to wholeness, it doesn't take place on some esoteric plane of existence, some alternate higher consciousness dimension. No, it takes place in the real world through concrete action. So if we want to engage in concrete actions derived in healthy midot, we have to have our material needs met, right? This is Maslow 101. You can't attain self-actualization if you don't have food, shelter, security, belonging, right?
By the way, some of the rabbis back in the day were quite chubby, to put it mildly. They ate well.
This is true. That's very true. And not just the rabbis. That's sort of a trope in medieval literature, that the common person was starving and the priests were all had gout because they're and like kidney stones because their diets were so rich.
Yeah, too much butter.
Too much butter. So
sorry.
So we can't attain our highest manifestations of ourselves. We can't get to that truly evolved mental and spiritual place if our stomachs are empty, right?
Yes.
We don't have, if we're sleeping in our cars or on the streets. So this is not about forsaking physical comfort. I will even go so far as to say this isn't about forsaking the occasional indulgence or splurge. This is about figuring out what enough is and then being satisfied with it. And we're going to end here because I just noticed it's 6:25, and boy, does time fly when we're having fun. But
when there's so much material.
There is so much material. And I was afraid that we wouldn't get through it all last time. So I just sort of like sped through it. And now I want to like take some time to savor and think. But yeah, so sorry, Neil, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. Christianity and Buddhism both have traditions of asceticism and denial.
Yes.
And Judaism does not. Judaism is in daily life, not in any way separated from it.
Yep. What was Samson? Hold on a second. What was Samson? A Nazarite. We had Nazarite.
Yeah. But a Nazarite was a special thing, and
right.
I mean, the Nazarites weren't starving themselves or sitting on top of a pillar for years, or
right. Yeah.
They had
foregoing women.
This is a really interesting and important point of divergence. Judaism teaches us that asceticism is as dangerous to our spiritual well-being as excesses. Moderation in all things. So much like we pray as if everything depends on God, but act as if everything depends on us. A belief in an afterlife doesn't necessarily preclude an urgency on our part to live and act as though we get one shot at this. And why is that important? Because that's the mindset we need to come at this assessment of what is it that I need and what can I do with that? So I'm going to share a personal anecdote, and then Neil, I'll open the floor back up to you. I like having my nails done. And it was something that I did for a really long time in my previous career, because I initially started doing it because I was told it would make me look more professional and it would advance my career, whatever. But I discovered that I actually liked having an hour out of my week where I knew that somebody was going to be focusing on me and making me feel taken care of. And then somewhere along the line, I got really self-conscious about the fact that I was spending this money and it felt frivolous. So I stopped doing it. And my emotional and mental well-being decreased. And I was less generous with my time and with my friends, and I was more snappish. And it sort of led to this domino effect of me cutting out other avenues for taking care of myself because that felt frivolous too. And then all of a sudden I was the shriveled up husk of a person. And that's a long roundabout way of saying that everybody's needs are individual and different. And if you find that you can function at your best self, in part because you spend an hour a week having somebody paint your fingernails, kol hakavod. Go for it. You do you. All right, Neil.
Yeah, best self. One of the patterns, the putting it all together that I'm seeing here is that these are concrete objectives or advice on how to not distract ourselves.
Yes.
Never miss an opportunity to perform a mitzvah implies always noticing when there's an opportunity.
Exactly.
Kind of an alertness and awareness of where you are in the world. I mean, physically, emotionally, socially, spiritually, whatever. And the opposites of each of these are distractions, which might keep us from noticing an opportunity to perform a mitzvah.
I would take that one step further. It's not just about providing us with the wherewithal to exclude distractions in order to see opportunities. It's providing us with the wherewithal to act on those opportunities, because it's all very well and good for me to see all of these opportunities to perform mitzvot, chasadim, whatever in the world. If I don't have the resources to take care of myself, I'm not going to be able to have the resources to engage in those broader mitzvot. I mean, it's a fundamental mitzvah to take care of yourself, but beyond that, I'm not going to have any capacity. All right, we are at time. We have gotten through a little under half of the midot that we have to cover. So I'm confident that we will get through this material next class. What I am curious about is if there is an interest in continuing this study further. If there is, do me a favor, shoot me an email with a couple of days or times of day that work well for you, and I will try to take all of that in consideration and find the time that works best for the most people.
So this time is out?
Not necessarily.
Oh, okay.
But I don't want to be so hubristic as to think that because it works for me, it works for everyone.
Ah, okay.
And I did hear some feedbacks from some other people that this time did not work for them, or they would have joined this class. So I'm trying to weigh those two things.
Gotcha.
Also, I sent a link for the book that I suggest we start with. Melanie, I think it was you who pointed out that there's not a whole lot of contemporary Mussar text out there, and that's very true, and there are a number of reasons why that is the case. This is a very good one, and I think that because, as we've sort of tap danced around, the terminology is we're still sort of like terra incognita as far as the vocab is concerned. I think it's important that we do at least one contemporary text before we delve into primary source documents, which we're going to have to do in pretty short order. We can study them in translation, but they're going to be either medieval or like Renaissance or 19th century texts. They're not going to be contemporary. So all of that being said, I've gone 2 minutes over and I'm sorry, but email me with your availability if you are interested. And thank you so much for joining me. I hope this was as fun for you guys as it was for me.
Thank you very much. It was. And thank you for the slides.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. My pleasure, Devorah. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.